In a quiet village surrounded by rolling hills and dusty paths, there lived a boy named Samuel, whose life seemed to be written in hardship from the very beginning. He was thin, his frame fragile, with dark curly hair that often fell over eyes filled with silent questions. His clothes were little more than faded hand-me-downs, stitched and restitched, never truly fitting. His stepfather, Joseph, towered over him in both presence and cruelty. A tall man with broad shoulders, rough hands, and a face hardened by bitterness, Joseph treated Samuel not as a son, but as a burden. From the break of dawn, while his own children still lay curled up in warm beds, Samuel was ordered to rise and fetch water from the distant river, his small arms trembling under the weight of buckets that left red marks across his skin. After that, there were fields to weed, goats to herd, firewood to gather, and countless chores that seemed designed not for necessity, but for punishment. At mealtime, Samuel's plate was the smallest, his food often just scraps, while Joseph's children ate their fill. The villagers noticed, but no one dared intervene, for Joseph's voice was sharp, his temper quick, and his shadow stretched long. Whenever Samuel slowed to catch his breath, Joseph's words lashed him like a whip. "You will never amount to anything. You are nothing." Samuel rarely replied, but each cruel phrase etched itself deep inside him, not as despair, but as fuel for a fire that was quietly waiting to burn. Despite the relentless mistreatment, Samuel's spirit refused to collapse under the weight of cruelty. When the chores were done and the house lay silent, he would sneak to the corner of a small hut where a weak lantern flickered, its light barely enough to push back the darkness. There he would open books borrowed from kind neighbors or left forgotten in dusty corners, devouring each page as though it were food for his starving soul. He scribbled notes on torn scraps of paper, balancing them on his knees even while watching the goats or carrying bundles of firewood. Knowledge became his secret weapon, his sanctuary, his silent rebellion. Joseph, however, despised Samuel's hunger to learn. He laughed coldly whenever he caught the boy studying, mocking the very idea that education could lift him out of his suffering. "Books will not feed you. Books will not change who you are," Joseph sneered, his own children joining in the laughter as they pointed at Samuel struggling to juggle books with heavy farm work. Yet Samuel's determination burned brighter with every insult. He carried the humiliation, not as chains, but as stones to build his future. He told himself in silence, "One day, these words will no longer bind me. One day, I will rise, and they will see what I was truly meant to be." His small lantern, weak as it was, became a symbol, a flame of hope against the darkness of cruelty. Years passed, and Samuel grew from a frail, weary boy into a young man with broad shoulders, steady eyes, and a heart hardened by endurance but softened by wisdom. His hands bore the scars of labor, but his mind had become sharp, a blade forged in fire. When the village gathered one bright afternoon for a grand ceremony in the town square, whispers spread like wind through the crowd. The son of the village had returned, not as a servant, but as a leader honored by the city for his wisdom, skill, and vision. Drums pounded, banners of red and gold swayed in the air, and hundreds of voices rose in excitement as Samuel stepped into the square. He was no longer in rags, no longer bent under the weight of buckets or firewood. His clothes were clean and elegant, his stride purposeful, his head lifted high. The people cheered his name, marveling at the transformation. But in the shadows of the crowd stood Joseph, his tall frame seeming smaller than ever, his face pale with disbelief. The man who had once declared Samuel worthless now saw the truth staring back at him. The boy he had scorned, mocked, and beaten down had become a man far greater than he had ever dreamed. Joseph's lips trembled, his eyes lowered, for he knew that the balance of power had shifted forever. As Samuel walked through the cheering crowd, he suddenly stopped. His gaze settled on Joseph, who stood frozen, shame etched across his hardened features. The crowd fell silent, sensing a moment heavy with meaning. Samuel's voice rang clear, steady and unshaken, cutting through the stillness of the square. You try to break me, Joseph, but every blow, every insult, every burden you placed on me, it only made me stronger. You gave me pain, but I turned it into power. You gave me rejection, but I turned it into determination. A child's value is not decided by cruelty, but by the strength of his own spirit. The villagers looked on, stunned by the courage in his words, their hearts swelling with pride. Joseph bowed his head, unable to meet Samuel's eyes. And in that moment, Samuel did not feel hatred or the urge for revenge. Instead, he felt something greater, victory not over Joseph, but over the shadows of his past. He walked on, shoulders tall, leaving Joseph behind in silence. The boy who once slept hungry, who once carried water before dawn, who once endured endless ridicule, had become a man of dignity and honor. The square erupted once more in cheers, but Samuel's lesson lingered in every heart. Greatness is not given, it is forged, and no cruelty can erase the destiny of a determined spirit.